What an amazing crowd. You are all made the right decision on what to do in Washington tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Lissa Muscatine, co-owner of the bookstore, and I'm on behalf of our wonderful staff and my husband and co-owner, who's sadly not here, but we can't feel too sorry for him. He's at a cooking class in Italy, so he couldn't be here. But before we get started tonight, we want to welcome all of you, of course. And before I introduce our author and our moderator, we have a very special treat. John Lasco is here. Many of you know John as one of the nation's and one of the region's finest actors. You've probably seen him perform during the 30 years he's been on the stage. He's graced nearly every performing arts venue in Washington: Kennedy Center, Ford's, Arena, Folger, Roundhouse, and others around the region and the country. John also has narrated audiobooks, a number of very excellent audiobooks. The latest, David Tatel's Vision. And the audiobook is available as a download. We hope you'll buy it on Libro FM, because that way you can support your local independent bookstore. But it is also available on all sources of audiobooks. And in a minute, you'll appreciate how special it is to have such a gifted actor as a narrator. John, can I invite you forward to read a little bit from Vision? Thank you.
A few people, both family and friends, encouraged me to think seriously about sharing my story. You're not just a blind person, they said, and you're not just a federal judge. You're a federal judge who happens to be blind. And you have a beautiful guide dog to boot. They believe that my story might inspire others, and not just people living with disabilities. That made me stop and think. I've spent my entire professional life, from my early days at the Lawyers Committee to my 3 decades on the DC circuit, trying to use the law to improve people's lives. If my life story might help other people, why not share it with the world? Maybe my story would challenge preconceived notions about what people with disabilities can accomplish. Maybe it would even inspire people to attend law school and to work for civil rights, either from inside the government or from out. And maybe, just maybe, I could convince a few more people to vote. I think that, yeah. I decided to give it a shot. I'd written thousands of legal briefs and judicial opinions. How hard could it be? Thank you.
And now for the main act, after that fabulous warm-up. I really can't overstate what a joy it is for us here at Politics and Prose to host Judge David Tatel to talk about his new book. The title, as I think most of you know, and you can see a copy of it here, is Vision, a Memoir of Blindness and Justice. And first, I just have to note that Judge Tatel and his family have a very long and special history with Politics and Prose. Not only have he and his wonderful and incomparable wife, Edie, been patrons of P&P for most of the past 4 decades, almost, I believe, since the store was founded. Several of their children, 3 to be exact, have worked here. And their daughter, Stephanie, and her future husband met during stints as booksellers at Politics and Prose. But tonight marks a new milestone in P&P's relationship with the Tatels. We have the privilege of hosting Judge Tatel for an author talk of his own. And we're especially delighted that he brought with him 2 central characters in his memoir. Edie, of course, to whom he has been married for almost 60 years, and without whom much of his life, and certainly this book, would not have been possible, I think it's fair to say. And his beloved and beautiful dog, and probably the star of the show, honestly, Vixen. Now, I know many of you have dogs, and you all think you have the world's greatest dog, but I just have to say, as a previous dog owner myself who had the world's greatest dog, Vixen really actually is probably the world's greatest dog. There can never be too many superlatives when talking about Edie or Vixen or about this book. Judge Tatel's recounting of his failing eyesight and his later in life reckoning with blindness would be a compelling tale of its own. The same is true for his career. The decades he spent in corporate law and pro bono legal work with civil rights advocacy groups at the Justice Department and as a federal judge and head of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Woven together, these two life stories, parallel and intertwined, make for a singularly magnificent memoir. Judge Tatel writes with candor and conviction and humor about matters personal and professional and even existential. From how he hikes and skis to the technology that assists him with reading and writing, to his and Edie's decision to get a guide dog, to the civil rights cases he is proudest of, to the state of the federal courts and the future of democracy. All of you here tonight, and it is an amazing crowd of people, family, friends, colleagues, and admirers, are a testament to the respect and affection Judge Tatel enjoys in this community and the impact he's had on our country. That he would entrust us with such a full, intimate portrait of his life and work, told with such love and honesty, is a gift to all his readers, page after page. In conversation with Judge Tatel tonight will be another great friend of Politics and Prose and one of the nation's most respected journalists, Jane Mayer. We can all thank Jane for being one of the earliest and most rigorous reporters to delve into the influence of dark money in American politics and in our judicial system, and especially the Supreme Court. In addition to writing 4 best-selling books, Jane has been a staff writer at The New Yorker for nearly 30 years. She's co-host of the New Yorker podcast, The Political Scene, with her colleagues Evan Osnos and Susan Glasser. And it would literally take me half of the night to recite the numerous awards she has received. Let's just note that a Polk Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a 2-time finalist for the National Book Award are on that very, very long list. Please join me in welcoming Judge David Tatel and Jane Mayer.
Lissa, thank you for that lovely introduction. It means so much to me. Edie and I have been part of the Politics and Prose community actually so long that it was on the other side of Connecticut Avenue when we first came here. There are so many, John, thank you for that lovely reading. The book sounds even better from you than it does on paper. There's so many people in this room that I could thank, but then we'd never get to the book. All my thank yous are in the acknowledgments, which I loved writing. So I hope you will get far enough in the book to read the acknowledgments. And finally, Jane, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss the book with you. I've admired your work and writings for decades. And so I've been asking questions for 30 years. Go ahead. Go for it, Jane.
Okay, now I finally got you where I want you. The first thing I wanted to make sure was that neither you nor Edie maybe spoke to any strangers on the way between the parking lot and the podium, because if you did, you're probably on Twitter already, having been taped surreptitiously. So we gathered tonight at a time when, as you know, the courts are not in the news at all. So anyway, this is the timing couldn't be better. David Tatel is a hero to many, including to me, not just for his wonderful career on the court, but also, I have to say, it's humiliating whenever I bump into him. He asks me if I've read the latest thing in the New Yorker, which he's already digested, and I haven't even opened the cover yet. And so this man is one of the most well-informed and fastest readers I have ever encountered, and it's completely remarkable. And his book is wonderful, and the New York Times got it right when they called it extraordinary. So this is a real pleasure. Though David did warn me about one thing tonight, which was that we would be here, but nobody was going to be here for us. they're going to be here for Vixen. And, she is, I'm a dog lover, and I have to admit, she is amazing what this dog can do. So the first question I've got for you is, everyone knows that you've been pretty reticent through your career about your blindness and about talking about yourself generally. And so, what broke the ice and made you decide to write this book? And was it Vixen? Did she nudge you?
I think nudge is probably the right word, Jane, but it's much deeper and much longer than that. The most important people in my life have been my wife Edie and my children, and living with them, I began to lose my eyesight, of course, at the beginning of our marriage. The children didn't really know me until I had lost quite a bit of it. And I mention this only because my confidence, when you read the book, you'll see that I spent many years denying and hiding my declining eyesight, which is why Jane asked that question, what's different now? Well, the main thing that's different is that after 60 years of wonderful marriage with the world's most supportive human being and my children, I've gained confidence, and the blindness, the declining sight and the blindness have simply not been as much of a concern to me as they once were. So that's one thing. The second is that as I look back on my life, I think one of the reasons why I worried about disclosing my declining sight is I worried that it would harm my chances of success in whatever field I chose. I really always worried about that, and it wasn't until even when I went on the D.C. circuit and over 30 years ago, when President Clinton nominated me to the court. I have no doubt that he nominated me in part because I was the first blind appeals court judge. I wanted to be on the court, that was great, but I didn't want to be known as the blind judge. After 30 years on the court, I feel as if I've become a judge who happens to be blind. I feel like, my record as a judge, I don't really have to worry anymore about what people think about whether I'm blind or not. So that factor had a lot to it. And then finally, there's Vixen. I did not get a guide dog until I was 77 years old. And one of the reasons why she's been so helpful to me is that, when you have I used a cane for many years. And when you use a cane, you're obviously blind, but people don't talk to you about being blind. When you have a guide dog, everybody wants to talk to you about the dog, how does she get you across the street. You can't not be blind and have a guide dog. And all these conversations over these years with people who admire Vixen and admire what we're doing together has really kind of broken the ice. So that's a long answer to your question, but it's evolved over many years, Jane. And I think the last thing I'd say about it is, you partly asked why I wrote the book. You heard John's quote. That's a quote from the epilogue. And I said that, when I was a young lawyer and even later worried that my career would not be helped by blindness, I had lots of role models in my life, but I had no blind role models. And one of the reasons I was ultimately persuaded to write this book is that I thought that maybe it would fill that gap for not only blind people, but also for sighted people who have doubts about what blind people can do. So.
Well, I think people probably have questions just about how you managed, even before the guide dog. And you have wonderful details in this book about your readers, and I gather you listen to books and all kinds of reading material at multiples of the normal spoken voice speed, right? It's like chipmunk talk. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you managed to achieve the things and get through the days
Yeah.
that you did? Because it's just incredible that you did.
Well, it's, to be honest, it's no fun being blind, but it's a lot easier being blind today than it was 30 years ago. And the reason is technology. Technology has made an enormous difference in my life. Here we go. An enormous distance in my life. Let me just give you one fact, which I think demonstrates this better than anything. When I went on the court in 1994, I had a full-time reader and a part-time reader. And my two readers read 95% of everything to me. Cases, briefs, letters, everything, 95%. By the time I left last year, I had one reader, no backup reader, and she read maybe 5% of materials to me. And that's because the world went digital and technology was able to convert text to speech, and that has just improved dramatically. And in the past year, artificial intelligence has improved it even more. So I can function, in terms of reading and writing almost completely on my own. It's just been a dramatic change for me and for other blind people.
And the dog is obviously old tech. Does an animal provide something different that all the technology in the world can't?
Yes. So the technology is great. The cane was great, but there are still huge limitations on one's mobility. The streets are dangerous, even with a cane. When I wanted to go out to lunch, had I ever been to the restaurant before and could I find my way with the cane? The cane travel is fine, but it doesn't give you the independence that I was looking for. Vixen does that in a totally amazing way. Vixen, the guide dog, has given me a level of mobility that I haven't had in 40 years. I can go on long. It used to be, Edie and I live in the country now. Whenever I wanted to go for a walk, I'd have to find out whether Edie could go with me. She loves to walk, but she didn't want to go with me all the time. Now, when I want to go for a walk, Vixen and I go, and if she wants to come, she joins us. The other thing, and I commute to work, to the courthouse. Vixen loves escalators, by the way. She's terrific on escalators and airplanes, and she's just given me a level of independence that's quite amazing. The one thing I'll add that, and Edie wrote this a couple of years ago after watching the process. She said, the other thing Vixen has done for me is to give me an opportunity to be alone. That is to walk alone in the country, which I was never able to do. And that aloneness is a treasured time. And in fact, I spent 3 years on this book in the country, and I don't have any doubt that all of those long walks with Vixen and my ability to think independently and by myself shaped how this book came out.
Well, I will get off the subject of blindness in a minute, but I have to put one question to you that was actually a friend, Sally Quinn, who's a very good interviewer, said, you've got to ask him, what do you miss most? What do you miss seeing the most?
It's a long list, but I would say, number one, I'd love to be able to wander through this bookstore all by myself.
Yeah.
Number two, I'd love to see my grandchildren's faces. But most important, I'd really like to see my wife's beautiful white hair. That's what I'd really like.
It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
So moving on to more sort of public affairs subjects, I know from being a reporter that it's like pulling teeth to get you to say anything injudicious. And I have tried, and I will keep trying tonight. But your book has made some news, though, because you have said in it that part of the reason that you stepped down when you did was you felt that the Supreme Court, no longer is fully respecting the judicial principles that are important to you, that something has changed. And I would love to get your sense of what you think has changed up there. And when?
I will, but I'm not going to be injudicious, no matter how hard you try.
This is the problem.
The court we have today is not the court we have when I. Well, let me say this: my book and my criticisms in the book are about the Supreme Court. They're not about individual justices. It is not a personal book. It's also a book that focuses on what I know best. It is not a broad brush examination of the Supreme Court. It's my conclusions about the court flow from the cases I've done and the court's review of those cases. So it's very focused in that sense. My concern about this court has to do with a very simple phrase, that is judicial restraint, or more accurately, the absence of judicial restraint. We all learned in the 7th or 8th grade about the critical role that the separation of powers and checks and balances play in protecting individual rights in this country, protecting people from abusive governmental power. And the only reason why the unelected courts have not upset the balance of power and the checks and balances is because the courts have restrained themselves. They've exercised the judicial power only when they absolutely have to. They've husbanded their power for the important points. And they've respected the Constitution and statutes. They've respected their own precedent. They've respected their limited jurisdiction. And through the use of these principles of judicial restraint, the court has confined itself on its own to the judicial role and kept it out of policy. My concern about this court, this Supreme Court, is that its decisions all too often abandon these basic principles of judicial restraint. And that over the years, this court, 5-4 decision by 5-4 decision, although now it's 6-3, has been expanding its own power at the expense of the two political branches of government. I think that's dangerous for a democracy. I hope that's the point I've tried to make in my book. I've tried to do it through several categories of cases. And it's one of the two reasons why I ended up at the end of my career writing this book.
You describe in the book very interestingly that sort of the two issues and areas of the law that are really your legacy focus in a lot of ways. One is environmental issues, a lot of them having to do with EPA-related cases. The other is voting rights cases. And in both those areas, it seems there have been, in recent years, precedents overturned and some of your decisions overturned. What is going on these issues? Do you think it's critics would say that it's a results-driven sort of political partisan kind of move on the court? Is that what we're looking at?
Jane, I've been very, very careful in my book not to get into the question of why or motive. I believe that one of the most important elements of judicial restraint, one of the most critical elements in judging, is the written opinion. Congressmen can vote yes or no. Judges can't do that. They have to explain themselves. And so I've confined my book and my thinking about this to the opinions themselves. And my concern is, what I've tried to explain in the book, is that if you read an opinion that's, say, disrespectful to the court's own precedent, either because it overrules it or overrules it for reasons that don't seem convincing, or, as this court does more and more frequently, overrules it without telling us it's overruling it. Or if you see a court, a judicial opinion that seems to be deciding a case where the court actually lacks jurisdiction, or when you see a case where the opinion seems quite disrespectful to the language Congress wrote, then you can ask yourself, well, maybe something else is going on here other than judging. I've left that up to other people. I've just raised the question from the perspective I have of looking carefully at these opinions and asking myself, well, are these legitimate acts of judging, or is something else going on? And I've ended my analysis at that point.
You describe in some ways, and I wondered if this was the beginning of, we've seen public opinion, sort of plunging in terms of trust in the court, and you talk in the book a little bit about how in Bush v. Gore, it was not an originalist opinion, even though it was decided by an originalist kind of majority. Was Bush v. Gore, in your view, the beginning of this change, or has it accelerated a lot since?
I don't think so. I think it's accelerated. As our country has become more polarized ideologically, as Congress has become increasingly dysfunctional, it's just inevitable that these big, hot-button political or policy issues would end up in our courts. And so the court's deciding many more cases of this kind than it used to. And then, of course, once the court started deciding questions of abortion and voting and speech and all of these other issues that the court's involved in, it was inevitable that the confirmation process would become more controversial, that organizations would try to shape the results of the court, the results of the court by selecting and appointing judges of different ideological interests. So it's a process that's evolved over the past, I would say, 2 decades, and it, in many ways, culminated in the last election, where you had in the next to last election, where you had a president who announced that he would appoint judges who would accomplish certain policy objectives. He gave us a list of the judges he would appoint. He appointed them. He won the election, and they did it. So it's not surprising that the public thinks the court is also a political institution. I say in the book, if you ask the average 9th grader in the country who makes all the important decisions in the country, they'd probably say the courts. That's really wrong. I mean, it's right, but it's really bad. It's not the way our system's supposed to function.
Well, and meanwhile, as we've seen, it's kind of put the court in the spotlight, and we've seen a lot of controversies, particularly in the last year, the ethics issues that have popped up. I guess I have to ask if you've gone on any Indonesian cruises, and has your wife flown any flags, or how do you handle these ethics issues when people offer you expensive goodies and such?
Well, let me answer the question by just saying how I handled. Well, first of all, no one's ever offered me, to be honest, an Indonesian cruise, and if they did, I'd put it on my financial disclosure form. In fact, the only money I made in the past few years was John Lesko and I were in a play together, and it was under a union contract, and I got $500, and I put it on my disclosure form. Let me just take a second and tell you how I, as a judge, approached a recusal question once. It involved a case that the D.C. Circuit had before it. The question was whether the court would order the Treasury Department to comply with a federal law that required paper currency. You remember what that stuff is? 10s and 20s and things, to be accessible to blind people. I cannot tell a 10 from a 20 without asking someone. When I go to Mexico, I can tell a 10 peso note from a 20 peso note. Same thing in Europe, not in the United States. This is an issue I feel really strongly about it. So I got assigned to the panel to hear this case. And I thought a lot about whether I should sit on the case. I felt very, as you can tell, I felt very strongly about this issue, but I believed that I could decide this case objectively. I knew that personally I could put my strong views about this aside and decide the case. In fact, my two colleagues encouraged me to stay on the panel, but I applied what is the Tatel 5-minute rule. And the 5-minute rule for me is if you have to think about a recusal issue for more than 5 minutes, you recuse yourself. Because you should, as this was my own philosophy about it, my own view about it was you should always side on the, you should always err on the side of the integrity of the court. And I was worried that even though I knew I could decide this case objectively, I worried that people have funny views about blindness in our country. I didn't want my court's decision to be in any way undermined by people thinking, well, there was a blind judge on the court and they ordered the government to spend billions of dollars making the currency accessible. And so I recused myself. And I, as I look back on it, I have no doubt, at least in my mind, that I did the right thing. Now, given all the controversy we're having today, I'll say it's easier for an appeals court judge to recuse himself or herself than it is for a Supreme Court justice, because when an appeals court judge recuses, another judge takes his place, which is what happened in the currency case. And by the way, they ended up writing a great opinion, even without me. So it's easier for a Court of Appeals judge to recuse. That's not so for the Supreme Court. There's only 9 justices. And if a justice recuses himself or herself, they have an 8-judge court, 8-justice court. And so the court's own ethical guidelines make very clear that justices have a special obligation to sit and not to recuse themselves. But to me, that means justices also have a coterminous, equally strong obligation not to get themselves into situations where they have to recuse themselves. Works both ways.
Very good. I guess I wonder, given the fact that we're past the moment where people have not recused themselves and have taken, in the case of one justice, something like $4 million worth of gifts over time. What do you see? Do you see any way that Chief Justice Roberts or the court can repair the damage now? And one of the things you do write about in the book, I think, is that you think maybe in the long term, term limits would be good for justices of 18 years, I think is what you suggested. But do you see any short-term as well as long-term changes that might really fix the court?
No, I've never been a fan of the big, I've never been a fan of adding more justices. I just don't like that idea. I was never a particular fan of term limits, but I am now. But why spend any time debating it? Isn't going to happen. There are major political and constitutional reasons why it won't happen. And you probably heard in John's little excerpt he read, I hope by writing this book I could maybe encourage people to vote. I mean, that's all we really have. Well, I shouldn't say all we have. The vote is an enormously powerful tool. We just have to use it. And I use the last chapter of my book, or that is the last chapter of the book before Vixen, to emphasize the importance of voting. If states put obstacles in your way, then get around the obstacles. If the states require an ID, then go get an ID and vote. You know, when you vote for president, if a president's saying he's going to appoint judges to accomplish a particular purpose, don't vote for that person. If you're voting for Congress, vote for members of Congress who will take their job in the checks and balances of our system seriously. Congress can check the court. It just doesn't do that. We need members of Congress who will take that responsibility seriously. This is obviously a very long-term answer to your question, Jane, but
it's a big
I don't
question.
know any
it's a
other
hard one.
answer to the question other than vote.
Well, in the subject, while we're talking about term limits, I have to bring up the fact that I think people would be interested in a private conversation you had with Ruth Bader Ginsburg about her retirement before she retired, before she left the court. She didn't retire. Can you just tell us a little bit about that conversation? And did you want to try to persuade her? Could anything have persuaded her? Or do you think it was really improper to try to?
Well, this was a conversation that I had with Ruth at our house, but this was I was certainly not the only person that Ruth complained to about pressure on her to retire. She made her concern about this pressure known to many people, and several times she talked to me about it. She usually would talk to me about it when there had been an op-ed piece calling her to recuse herself. She didn't like that. And I remember she said to me at one point, she said, John Stevens served on the court till he was 90. And I even think that maybe the pressure on her convinced her to stay. I think she thought, here's what I think she thought. She never said this to me, but I think she thought that she could stay and that she would be replaced by the first woman president. I think that's what Ruth Ginsburg really wanted. Now, she rolled the dice and lost. And the consequences of that were enormous. But you ask whether I tried to persuade her, Jane. No one would even dare, at least me, try to persuade Ruth Ginsburg of anything. I assure you.
Well, we're going to take some questions in a minute. I just wanted to ask you one more thing about this. We're in a kind of a big moment in terms of decisions coming down, and I don't know. I don't know if you can answer this, but I am curious what you think of the we should expect in the Trump immunity case and what you might want to see.
Well, I'll answer that question generally about the immunity case and a couple of other these cases. I actually thought the D.C. Circuit opinion in the case was persuasive. I read it and thought it made sense. But I have no objection to the Supreme Court granting cert in the case. In fact, if I had been on the court, I probably would have voted to hear the case too. Even though the D.C. Circuit might have been completely correct, there are some issues in our country that are so important that they need to be resolved by the highest court in the land. So I don't object at all to the court agreeing to hear that case. Nor, to be honest, do I object to the court deciding the case in the normal course. It's an important issue, and the court needs to get it correct, and I don't have any problem. Timing is not the court's problem. What I do hope is that whatever the court does, whatever it does, in that case and the other major cases we have coming, I hope they step back and try to produce opinions that are unanimous opinions, or at least opinions that aren't divided by appointing president. And I hope they work really hard to convince us, that is the public, I'm now a member of the public, that these are legitimate acts of judging, that whether you agree with the result or not, we respect it. And that's what I hope the court does with the immunity case and with the other big cases that are on its docket. This is a great opportunity for the court to act like a court and issue opinions that the public can have confidence in as legitimate acts of judging. That's what I hope happens.
We may have to call you back and have a sequel after the opinions come down and get your analysis. But you've actually, your reputation is as a judge who was able to work across party lines and see the best in people who had political differences with you. I'm just curious, before we take some questions, how did you do that, and why is it being lost?
I loved that part of judging. I thought one of the most fascinating part of the job. Courts of appeals judges, we don't sit alone. We can't just decide a case. You have to you have to work through a case with two colleagues. And I loved that process. I loved the give and take, the discussion among the judges of issues. And I thought, I have no doubt that process, that collegial process of judging produces better opinions. I learned an enormous amount from my colleagues, and I hope they learned a huge amount from me. We hear a lot of talk these days in the press and among certain judges about judicial collegiality. And what do they talk about? They say, well, we have lunch together, or we go to basketball games together, or we sing songs at Christmas. We do all these things as a court, and there are justices who talk about that and appeals courts judges who talk about that. That's not the kind of that's not judicial collegiality. Judicial collegiality doesn't have anything to do with whether they have lunch together. It has to do with whether the judges are listening respectfully to each other, are learning from each other, and sometimes even changing their minds. That's what judicial collegiality is, and it's very important to the integrity of the judicial process.
On that note, should we take some questions from the audience? And I would just, I want to make sure that they're actually questions, not statements. So if people going to come up to the microphones, it looks like there's a gentleman here already. So
before I ask my question, I want to say thank you for your service. And I also want to thank Attorney General Garland for his service, being the right person at the right time in an important position. So this evening's news had many audio tapes from Justice Alito and his wife, which suggested on his part that he lacks the ability or the desire to be impartial. We know what has trailed Justice Thomas. And I said to my wife, as we sat down to dinner, that about 50 years ago, a justice by the name of Aide Fortas resigned from the Supreme Court for having borrowed, I think it was $20,000.
So
my question to you is, what has changed so much in the last 50 years that justices can behave the way Alito and Thomas do with virtually total impunity? Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry if you think this doesn't answer your question, but I'll repeat what I said before, which is I wrote this book about the Supreme Court, not about the justices. Other people can talk about that. My focus was on this court as an institution, and I'm not in the book. I don't get into the behavior of individual justices or judges, and I'm not going to do that tonight.
another question right here.
Hi, Judge Tatel. My name's Alex Aronson. My wife Beth had the tremendous honor to serve as one of your law clerks, and has just extraordinary regard for you, our family does, and for your legacy and the service you've given to our country. I work on court reform issues in this moment of what many of us, I think, feel is a crisis for exactly what you're talking about, the court's legitimacy and its institutional integrity. And I wanted to thank you first and foremost for the really plain-spoken concerns you've raised in this book and in your comments tonight about what's happening to the institution, as so many of us who have invested our lives in the law, and even non-lawyers who see what's going on and feel like something is deeply out of kilter. And so I wanted to ask you, as a former judge, whether you think there is more of you out there, because more of you out there, more former judges like you, or even sitting judges on the bench. I know they're hard, and it's hard for them, constrained by their positions within this institution, to speak as forthrightly about these concerns as you have. But I do think it's incredibly powerful to have somebody of your stature, of your legacy, deliver this message in this moment of democratic crisis. And so that's my question to you: is do you think there's more former judges of you out there, and what can we do to embolden them to speak out like you have?
More former judges or just judges?
Well, let's leave it to the former judges, so that there's no.
I can just tell you there are lots of wonderfully gifted judges working in our federal court system who are producing thoroughly justified judicial opinions. our court system is it's a rich, wonderful institution full of really capable people. So no, I'm not alone at all, and I can tell you, there are lots of judges who share my concerns. I'm not alone. I have the advantage of having. I'm still trying to get used to the word retired before my name, but I'll get there. But it is easier for me to talk about it now. But rest assured, I am not alone in these views.
Okay. Hi, I'm Janet Lowenthal, and I don't have a question. I have a very particular thank you for your openness about your blindness, which I see as a great act of generosity that could make a big difference for families that were like mine growing up, because my father had RP. And unlike you, he never, until very, very late in the game, was willing to talk about it, even with my mother, and certainly not with the children. And what finally made a difference was when a small group of people got together with Elliot Burson, whom you cite in the book, to start the RP Foundation. But growing up, I just intuitively understood from a very, very early age that there were just some things that you didn't mention and you didn't react to. Like if my father came home and I had built, this happened one day, a big house of cards on the living room floor, and he just shuffled through the cards, and I just knew this is not something I would react to. Or, you know, the endless bottles of vitamin A that were all over the breakfast room, or when he stopped driving from one day to the next. So I think that your openness can really help when other people are going through these things today. So
Thank you. Thank you.
so
I'll say only I totally understand where your father was coming from.
Oh, wow.
yeah, no, look, me too. A very different generation and very reserved person. But
Thank you.
Hi, David. It's Judy Winston, and I want to know how you are. You went. Let me put the
up a
mic
little,
up a little
yeah.
bit. I want to know, David. I know you as being a very, very hard worker, and I'm wondering two things. One, what you are doing with your time now that you are retired, and two, I know you're walking a lot with Vixen. I also want to know whether or not you anticipate doing any more writing to help us better understand what we need to think about in terms of the court and the judicial process.
Well, one thing I am totally sure of, Judy, I am not writing another book. That's that. So what am I
Op-ed
doing?
pieces, maybe?
Pardon me?
Op-ed pieces, maybe?
Not for a while, please. You know, I mean, this book has been all-consuming for 3 years. It still is. I love this part of the book. So this is fun. I hope it continues for a while. I've returned to Hogan Lovells from whence I came many years ago. And in the fall, when things lighten up with the book, I hope to be able to work a little bit in the pro bono program. But I'm not going to practice law. I'm not going to take depositions or argue cases. I've been there and done that. I would like to help out in the pro bono program, and I'd like to go for long walks with my dog and go back to reading books. That's what I'd like to do.
One more.
Thank you again for being here. I was curious if you read and write Braille, and in this age of technology, what you recommend or what your feelings for young people, young blind people learning to read and write Braille.
So I didn't really lose my sight until my mid-30s. And so I did not learn Braille as a child. I did learn it. I put quotes around the word learn. When I was about 33 or 34. But I never really learned to read it. I can do it letter by letter. So it isn't something that I use. I do know how to type Braille, which is helpful because You know, when I was in the 6th grade or 7th grade, boys took shop, not typing. So I never learned to type. I don't know what to answer your question today. You know, I'll just tell you this. Yesterday, one of my former partner's wives, who works in a local school, brought a little 10-year-old to meet me. She's blind, and she brought in her math work that she's worked. She just got an A on a math test, and she brought it to show me, and it's in Braille. And you know, she was explaining to me how there were charts and graphs all in Braille. I had no idea what it was, but obviously, you know, Braille users are extraordinary with their ability to read it. I think fewer and fewer people learn Braille because of the technology. You know, I think people just don't need it as much. But you know, I think in schools for the blind and elsewhere, I think Braille is still taught and probably pretty critical. I just never learned it. It was never helpful to me.
Here comes another question.
Hi, Judge Tatel. Aletta Margolis here. I have a question for you. I'm so glad you're focusing on the importance of voting, and I imagine most of us who read your book are people who are inclined to vote. How do we engage with everybody else and encourage them to vote? And if you want to invoke teachers and education in your answer, that would be fabulous.
That's
But how do
Aletta,
we reach?
We call that a leading question.
I don't have to answer Aletta's question. She just answered it. I mean, you know, that's I don't know the answer to that. There are many wonderful organizations in our country. I just think focusing on voting is really, really, you know, we tend to think that the vote, what's one vote? But the fact is, everybody has a vote, and votes, just, if I was still writing the book, I'd add a sentence. If you have any doubts about the importance of your vote, just look at what recently happened in Wisconsin and Michigan. That's what you can do with the vote. So,
Thank you.
All right. Paul Taylor.
David, Paul, I'm an old friend. I'm going to use that to ask you two questions. First, I noticed you have a Band-Aid on your forehead. I've known you a long time. I've seen many Band-Aids on your forehead. And I wonder if you can tell us how you got this one. And then secondly, more seriously, I wonder if you could talk about the role that Edie has played, not just in your life, but very intensely over the last few years in the writing of this book.
Okay, Paul, my friend. If you had asked me that first question 5 years ago, I would have been extremely annoyed. Well, you probably wouldn't have asked it.
No.
Right? Which tells you a lot about how this book has affected my thinking about blindness. I mean, I'm going to answer your question about the Band-Aid, but writing this book wasn't just writing down a story. It required deep thinking about myself and Edie and the law. The book itself was an adventure. I think Lissa used the word, I think she did in the introduction, that the book is very much a coda to my adventure in both blindness and judging. So I learned a lot, which is why it's a long way of saying why I'm not annoyed at my friend Paul for asking that question. All right, you want to know what happened?
I do.
What happened was about 2 o'clock, I won't tell you where I was, but I had dropped something, which I obviously couldn't find. That's one of the great hazards. Vixen is fabulous, but she will not find she'll find some things that I dropped, but this particular item she was not interested in finding. I couldn't find it, and I reached over to get another version of it, and I hit my head on the wall. And Edie and I had a big debate today. Should I keep the Band-Aid on or not? And yes, you're right. I've had Band-Aids on my head for many years, and that's one of the things that happens to people who are blind. All right, your second question is much more interesting and much more important. So Edie and I, we've been married almost 60 years. Edie is Edie is herself a brilliant writer, and she's edited and helped me write for my entire career, including my years on the court. There were many opinions I showed to Edie in draft form because I believe that, as I said before, opinions are the most important thing a judge does, and people need to understand them. And sometimes I needed help from Edie and how to convert some complicated stuff into things people could read. Which brings us to this book. You know, when I decided to write the book, Edie was very much part of that process. It's something we decided that I should do. She obviously helped me work through the proposal and the early stages of it, but I'd say halfway through, it turned into a joint project. And we very much wrote this book together. We worked on it day in and day out. I would draft, she would rewrite, she would draft something, I'd edit, we would debate, we would argue, and sort of slowly in that process, this book emerged. Now, one of the reasons why it worked so well is that, you know, yes, Edie was my writing partner, my co-collaborator, but she's as much a part of the story as I was. I mean, this book is very much a book about the two of us. And so when we were writing, we were discussing our own history, our own experience with blindness and our kids, and, you know, what did we think about when we started to have children, and all those complicated questions, which frankly, we didn't think about very much until we got into the book. So the book turned out to be not just a collaboration between Edie and me, but a joint examination and adventure into our experience in both of us living with declining sight and blindness. It's we both lived it. It's not just me. It's the two of us, and the book is far richer because of Edie's involvement and thinking about it. And the other thing she will tell you is that there were a whole bunch of things she learned in this process she did not know, which I can tell you caused a few rough moments in the writing process. You did what? She said. There were many of those moments, but we are still very happily married and much stronger because of the book.
Well, we're so happy that you wrote the book, that you had this amazing career, and that you came out to talk to us tonight. So thank you so much for doing this and for everything. Thank you.